Um, so thanks a lot for joining us. Um, Shambhavi and I both work for WWF. I am Preston Witt. I'm the anti-corruption advisor and research coordinator for the TNRC project targeting natural resource corruption. Shambhavi, I'll let introduce herself in a minute. Um, and just a few, I'm going to start with a few introductory notes about TNRC. So we're a 5.5 year project. We are entering our last phase, but we were funded by USAID and are a consortium of different organizations. They're listed at the bottom, although primarily it's Traffic and the Basel Institute that we currently work with most. And essentially, we're a knowledge generation project. So we've produced more than 100 resources, including the results chains that we're going to talk about today. We have, I think, 10 or 12 in-country concrete activities, including the activities in WWF Nepal that Shambhavi will speak about. And then we've done quite a few, more than 80 learning events and knowledge exchanges and things like that. Things like this session tonight. The 6 topic areas that we focus on, so targeting natural resource corruption. We look at corruption, especially in fish, forest, and wildlife. And most of our work falls into at least one of these topic areas. So law enforcement, criminal justice, the ways that corruption can undermine law enforcement approaches to conservation, as well as more law enforcement and criminal justice approaches for targeting corruption. Related to that, we've done quite a bit, and especially our colleagues at the Basel Institute have done quite a bit on illicit financial flows. So following the money, trying to uncover who's ultimately profiting from environmental crimes, trying to interrupt those networks, prevent them from being able to profit from their crimes, and in that way reduce the incentives to engage in those activities. We've done a lot with supply chains. So I mentioned fish and forests. So those are legal supply chains. And we've looked a lot at how corruption can allow illegal products or illicit products to be laundered into those supply chains, as well as the supply chains for completely illicit products like rhino horn, for example. Open governance, since so many anti-corruption approaches involve transparency, accountability, and civic participation, as well as social norms and behavior change. So looking at corruption as a social norm and trying to leverage behavioral science to shift those corrupt behaviors. And then finally, communities and inclusion. So everything from the ways that corruption can undermine really important community and local stakeholder aspects of conservation, like with benefit sharing, to more soft power approaches that really leverage a community-based perspective to reduce corruption risks. So I will go into each of these and walk through them. But so these are the 4 model results chains that we've produced. So we've taken the knowledge from those topic areas that I mentioned, as well as the experiences and theories of change of our in-country activities like Shambhavi's, and generated these 4 tools that we're currently working with CMP and Foundations of Success to get them into the Conservation Action and Measures Library, CAML, which is also, as you'll see when I go through these, the sort of the basis upon which we built these tools. And the 4 are integrating anti-corruption into traceability efforts, the importance of anti-corruption for law enforcement, transparency and accountability for market-based incentives for conservation, and then social norms and behavior change for anti-corruption. So I'm just going to switch my screen. Right. So this is a closer view of the law enforcement results chain that we created. So we started with the high level generic theory of change that's from CAML, looking at wildlife trade law enforcement. And then in some areas we've sort of simplified, but primarily what we've done is just add additional content and information and resources about anti-corruption, and that's indicated by the text in red. So for example, when you're doing your situation analysis at the beginning of a law enforcement based approach, there are specific elements to bear in mind to apply sort of a corruption lens to that situation analysis. Sort of starting with a corruption-informed analysis from the beginning helps make sure that that your law enforcement strategies will be better, more effective, but also safer. Similarly, there are important skills and norms that are especially relevant to anti-corruption. So we've included those here within the larger capacity building set of intermediate results. We've included resources, it's hard to make it appear here, about the importance of strengthening the judicial system, different types of activities like court monitoring, where conservation orgs can help ensure that the justice system delivers justice for wildlife, and that the law enforcement process is not undermined or derailed by corruption. If you do all of that and then actually arrest, prosecute the traffickers, and couple that with some broader enabling environment initiatives, then you would get your ultimate outcomes of the threats being reduced and people and planet being better off. I'm just going to do this one and then one more, and then I'll turn it over to Shambhavi to actually talk about a real world activity. And then after that, I'll come back to the 4th one and show where Shambhavi's activity sort of informed that results chain. Our overall goal with this session and the one that we did earlier today for the other time zones, both to share the tools that we've produced, kind of to celebrate what we were able to do using the sort of basis tools that do already exist through CMP, Depending on if your work directly corresponds to one of these topic areas, hopefully help identify where some entry points are for incorporating anti-corruption into that work and using these tools in the future. This results chain, as you can see, this is the one about traceability. So again, we adapted this from market-based incentives, but specifically wanted to focus on the traceability element. We talked about this a lot in the earlier session because this is where things like technological approaches to tracking products as they move through the supply chain. That's sort of what this would look like as an actual project. And so if you're doing that, there are specific, again, anti-corruption guide elements, and we've included guidance and links and resources for incorporating those elements into your traceability project. So just as an example, making sure that high-level corruption doesn't undermine you from the very beginning, making sure that the standards that are developed are sufficient and don't favor an industry with particular political power. Once you have the standards, actually creating an adequate traceability system. We've done quite a lot of work on where some of the most common gaps are in traceability systems. For example, many of them don't go all the way to the point of capture or the point of harvest of the tree or the fish. So they do a really good job of tracing everything else once it is sort of brought to the dock. But if the fish wasn't caught in the appropriate way, or it's not the right size, or there's some other sort of corruption or illicit behavior that gets that laundered into the official system, then your very, very good official system has just traced what is essentially useless or inaccurate information. We've also, with these, tried to, and this is thanks to feedback that we got from CMP in an earlier preview of these, highlight the connections between all of these different elements. So I started with the law enforcement results chain. There's obviously a role for law enforcement in enforcing traceability systems. So we've included some of that information here, and then also links back to the previous resources. And then the last one, before we get to Shambhavi, this is also derived from the market-based incentives, high-level theory of change. But here we really wanted to focus less on sort of the concrete incentive of like sort of traceability and the additional prices that can help you bring, and focus more on sort of the ways that open governance topic area can be brought to bear. So specifically transparency and accountability. So again, making sure that your traceability system is actually transparent, because those two things aren't the same. Transparency meaning that you have in place means for others to monitor that system and the value chain to ensure that there's actually integrity there, as well as on the kind of at the production level, if that's where the market-based incentive is taking place, different elements of transparency, accountability, and participation to ensure that there isn't like free riding or abuses at that sort of local level that could again undermine the entire process. So I'm going to stop. Happy to answer any questions. Those are the, like I said, the really high level stuff. We'll actually hear the story of Shambhavi's project next, but if there are any high level results chains related questions, happy to take those.
Yeah, just a quick question. Like you focus like mostly on that like law enforcement, but in some case like corruption happen because there's no law. So how will you take that into the account when there's not really like policy or law in places in many of the natural resource country, and also it can take very long time to make like to influence like local and also national government to like push to make law. So I can see that it's after challenge too. And another question is how you incorporate the community and inclusion in those high level research chain.
Thank you. Those are really great points and questions. So your third question is actually what I would respond as the answer to the first one. So where there isn't effective law enforcement, whether that's because there's just not a state presence in that area, or the law enforcement that is there is not as effective as it could be, or perhaps as ethical as it could be, that is where it's really important to take more of that sort of social accountability, communities and inclusion approach. So we did an earlier piece. That's why it's not one of the 4 that I showed, that was looking at sustainable livelihood interventions, specifically revenue sharing around protected areas, benefit sharing from nature-based solutions, as well as nature-based solutions. A third one that I can't remember at the moment. And so those are focused much more on what you do to create the incentives at the local level for conservation, and ensuring that as you do so, that you're avoiding some of those really common pitfalls like elite capture of community funds, of risks of essentially recreating negative dynamics like power dynamics or dynamics of exclusion at the local level, because especially with things like parks, right, you're to a certain extent you're creating rules and giving someone, even if it's someone at the local level, the power or at least the responsibility to enforce those rules. And so anytime you're doing that, where you're creating some sort of power structure or leveraging an existing power structure, you have to build in these safeguards to avoid creating corruption risks. I will say, let's also hear from Shambhavi, because her activity does touch on a lot of these, and then we can come back and discuss more after that. If that makes sense.
Shambhavi, would you like me to share the PowerPoint?
Yes, please. I'll start introducing myself while you're setting up the presentation. So, hi everyone, my name is Sambhavi and I'm the Senior Campaigns and Education Officer at WWF Nepal. So my role basically entails working with children and young people across all WWF Nepal's thematic areas. So because you also said you wanted to learn a bit about conservation, I'll also touch upon those things while I talk about governance and corruption in our project. So governance is one of our cross-cutting at WWF Nepal. So this project engages young people to ensure that we have good governance and eventually to ensure that we achieve the conservation outcome. So this is how I am involved in the project. But we also have a governance specialist who is also a part of the project, and he couldn't be here today. So I think I can start.
For sure. Just let me know whenever you'd like
screen.
me to change any slides.
Yes. I think we could go to the next one. So this project, like the name says, it's youth-led good governance in community forests in Nepal. So you must be wondering why young people and suddenly why are we doing things differently? But this was based on the findings from the first phase of the project. So in the first phase of the project, TNRC 1, we did a governance gaps and need assessment in the community forest in Nepal. So when we talk about conservation in Nepal, we have national parks, but apart from that, when we talk about people-led conservation and we talk about communities' role in conservation, it's mostly through buffer zones, community forest, and protected areas. So community forest is one of the leaders in the people-led conservation efforts. So the idea is that the people in the community protect the forest, they make use of the forest, and in return, they protect it. So that's the whole concept of community forest in Nepal. So community forest generates income from fuel wood, timber, and selling different kind of fodder within the forest. So that's how community forest generally generates income. So the community forest income that comes to it has a different proportion that's guided by the policy. So for example, they have to invest 35% of the community forest income in the livelihood of poor people in the community. They have to invest certain percent in protecting the forest. They invest certain percent in community development. So this is how the community income is spent within the community and for community development. So when we did a governance assessment in few community forests that we had worked in phase 1, we identified that there were a lot of irregularities in documentation, reporting. So just to give you an example, even the basics were absent in some of the community forests. The community forest that we worked for this project, phase 2, it didn't even have a bank account. They didn't have proper registers. They didn't have accounting systems. So they were really, really absent in terms of a proper procedure to record things. So through this, there was a lot of abuse of authorities because there was no system in place. You didn't know how income was coming, where it was going from, because there was no bank account, there was no digital systems. There were just few people signing documents, and that was how the fund was flowing out. So second finding was there was a low participation of young people and socially marginalized people in these community forests. So I think participation of young people has been an issue in Nepal, not just in community forest, but conservation in general. So we did an assessment on this one, and people now aspire to work for corporates. They want to study abroad. They want to do different things, but they do not want to get engaged in something like community forest or work for national parks. So that is the current mindset of young people, especially in these community forests. So that was one of the findings of the project. And the third one was, like I said earlier, certain percent of the income goes to livelihood intervention, supporting livelihoods of poor households in the specific community. And that was also not happening. So what this led to was that because there was no income, there was nothing for these poor people to get engaged in, they were not interested to become a part of the community forest. So this was an automatic elite capture because these people could not afford to go to meetings to a place where they were getting nothing from. So these are the people who make living on a daily basis, bread and butter they earn every day. So they couldn't attend meetings. They were really not interested in the community forest plans or becoming a part of the committees. So these elite capture, it was very easy for them to easily, and they even in meetings they would say that we invited these people but they couldn't make it. So there was a lot of different elements if you dig why people were not engaged in this one. So through our intervention we plan to address all three issues. So we engaged young people. So the project goal was to mobilize young people to increase good governance in the community forest. So in our phase 2, we addressed all three findings. So we had trainings to ensure that the documentation is done well, there's a proper reporting system in place, auditing happens every year, there's a bank account, everything is documented. And we did this through mobilizing young people. So we also tried to address participation of young people, and because there was no interest of people who were socially marginalized, so we also had a small bit of livelihood intervention in the project. So the intention of the livelihood intervention was that when they were procuring, so when we talk about livelihoods community forest, I again mentioned they get it through fuel, wood, and timber. So the livelihood intervention was we provided certain saplings in the community forest so that they could sell things out of it. So to be specific, we provided bamboo saplings, fruit saplings. There's this broom sapling we call ombriso in Nepal. So these kind of saplings, so they could make money every year, and we could ensure that people who are excluded take interest in community forest. And through this livelihood intervention, we also wanted to practice a good procurement policy, because that was something that was missing in the project in all of the community forest. So we decided to have livelihood intervention, both to show what a good procurement policy is, and also to ensure that socially excluded people are now interested in the community forest, because they'll now be getting benefits out of the income of whatever was provided through the project. I think we can move on to the next one. So this project is very specifically focusing on three different community forests, namely Amar Gokul, Kopila Janjagruti, and Ganga Jamuna. So these community forests are interlinked, so they're connected to each other. So it's like a patch that we picked because we didn't want to do dispersed intervention. So these are generally the same community, so it lies on the same community, and these are adjoining forests. So we picked 3 community forests out of, there were I think 12 of them that we conducted the assessment in. And also the reason for this was this community forest lies in a very critical biological corridor, which connects a national park in Nepal and in India. And to be very specific about the animals, these corridors are mostly used by tiger and elephants. So this is a very critical corridor for WWF, and we decided to use these community forests in these corridors for this project. And the reason for this is also because this project was for 1 year and we didn't want to stop after a year. So we picked an area where WWF would be working even after the specific governance project ends, to monitor and see how the result of this project is showing in later years. Can we move on to the next one? Okay. So to talk about the project, so we had 3 specific outcomes. The larger goal, like I mentioned, was good governance, engaging young people, and eventually ensuring conservation outcomes. But to break it down into 3 specific outcomes, we had a first outcome that was focused on increasing capacity and knowledge of the young stakeholders in the community forest. The second outcome was then to engage these young people to mobilize larger number of young people, because just having 25 or 40 young people will not change things. So we wanted to engage larger young people. So for the capacity building, we picked 40 young people who were engaged in community forest in one way or the other. So they were beneficiaries, they were people in the subcommittees who were not actively participating, but they were still there in the structure. So these were the young people. And we also engaged young people who had some power in the community. So for example, there was a district chair who was a young person. There was a district forest officer who was a young person. So we also onboarded these young people in the capacity building trainings. But we didn't want to leave out the rest of the community and the young people in those communities, because these are also the people we want to become a part of conservation and community forest. So for the second outcome, we focused on mobilizing the 40 young people to mobilize other 400 young people in these communities. And then the third outcome was to create an enabling environment for these young people, because we know even as adults, if we talk about corruption, it's not always accepted really well. So especially for young people, it was a hard task to talk about corruption in the communities. So the third outcome was focused on creating relationships between right bearers, duty holders, government stakeholders, so that they take the young people seriously and the young people are safe enough to voice their issues about corruption. So the first outcome was capacity building of stakeholders. So when we trained 40 young people in a lot of different trainings. So it was about good governance, documentation, account keeping, bookkeeping. So a lot of different kind of trainings was held for these young people. So we had youth both as duty bearers and right holders, and they also had structured reflections to identify what corruption meant for them, because corruption could mean a lot of different things and it could happen in a lot of different ways. So these young people had structured reflections to identify how corruption could happen in the communities, what was not really happening systematically in their community forest. So this was the first step where the young people actually understood what corruption was, how could they tackle it, what is the appropriate way of doing things, and what is not the right thing to do. So these were a lot of different trainings were held for these young people. So I think we can move on to the next one. So once the young people were capacitated enough, they now spread the awareness and engaged a lot of young people within their communities. So the first photo you can see, they also went to schools. So sometimes we think that the children are too young to talk about corruption, but that's not always true. There's actually study about good governance in schools, but they don't really understand what the practicality of it is. So it's very theoretical. So this one was with the schools, and there were a lot of community events that was held. There were dramas, they were singing a lot of different songs about corruption. So they did it their youth way. So they did a lot of awareness events, reaching out to 400 young people and also community, so that now everybody is talking about corruption, understanding what the corruption is. And it's not just about raising awareness. This also created a pressure on people who are in the committee of the community forest, because now everybody around you is talking about good governance and what should happen. So I think this also built pressure on these people. So next one. So like I said, we also provided saplings. So this was one of the picture of that. And we also held meetings with district forest offices, because the community forest comes under the district forest offices. And there were also meetings with different stakeholders, the district administration office, the chairperson of the community forest themselves, because we didn't want the adult to feel like they were being attacked or they were not a part of the project, because corruption is everyone's responsibility. To reduce corruption is everyone's responsibility. So a different level of meetings were also held to ensure buy-in of these stakeholders. Next one. So achievements is, of course, there was increased knowledge and skills of youth champions in terms of good governance and corruption. And this is all evidence-based. We have baseline and end line of all of these activities, because then we know what exactly has changed. There's also increased interest of young people now in the community forest. So now if you talk to young people in the communities, they want to become a part of community forest, they want to contribute. So that is also an immediate change that we've seen through our projects. There's also a commitment from stakeholders to support youth champions. There are a lot of videos now on YouTube where our powerful government stakeholders have committed to support the project and support young people to fight against corruption. So that is also an immediate result that we've seen through our intervention. And the fourth one is there's also been some operational changes. So now they've used the public procurement policy. Like I said, when they were procuring the saplings, they've now used the policies. They have now approved operational procedures in place. They have bank accounts. So there's also visible systematic changes that we've seen immediately through our interventions. And I think the end line report will be very, very specific and talk about what exactly the change is, but it's not final yet. So I'm being very broad in talking about the achievements in general. So the challenges with this project is that it was quite short. And if you talk about corruption, I think countries have been working for decades to minimize corruption or eliminate corruption. But 1 year seemed a bit short, because I think we were at a phase where young people were like, now we want to change the system, and now we're suddenly phasing out. So I think the short span of the project was a challenge. If it had been for like 3 years, 5 years, I think we would actually be able to eradicate corruption in at least the community forest that we are targeting. And I think the next challenge is that there's also individual and social risk associated for the youth champions. Because if I talk about corruption in my office, maybe I might look like I'm blaming everyone to become corrupt. And there's a lot of social exclusion at some levels in this community forest. So this is also one of the challenges that some young people have faced. So now they're not really liked by the chairperson of the community forest, not really liked by people who are engaged in corruption. So that is also one of the risks that we see when we talk about corruption projects in general. So while I mentioned the challenge, we have also strategies to ensure that we reduce whatever we can through our interventions. So for the short span that I mentioned earlier, we'll be providing ongoing support through WWF's regular intervention. So just checking on if the systems are working, if the young people are at threat, or, just if it's being practiced, whatever we've established through this project. So we'll do that through our regular intervention, because WWF works in these areas as a part of our forest programs, because they're a very critical corridor. And we've also done the activity to tie up youth champions with the local government, because then the project is owned also by the local government, and these young people are safe within their communities. So we've also established this kind of relationships. And we've also established relationship between duty bearers and right holders within the community. So by inviting them to our meetings, having discussions, so that they take young people and their voice as it is, and there's a social acceptance and harmony in the community. So this is the project in general. If you have any specific questions, please.
Thank you so much, Nambhavi. One question I did have was, these, in your opinion, across Nepal, are the, community forests expanding in terms of number and overall amount of land, or do you think it's going the opposite direction or staying about the same?
No, it's not expanding. We have currently over 16,000 community forests in Nepal, and they'll be just as they are in terms of numbers. But now we have a new concept of OECM. So to increase the forest cover in Nepal, we'll move on to OECM strategies, but will not be changing the number of community forests. It's all taken.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
I've got a quick question just about sustainability and moving forward. And I was wondering if you can talk, I know you did mention your strategies for sustainability, but I was wondering if you could talk specifically about the types of indicators that you would put into place to monitor that sustainability over time, and what types of methods you're using, if it's like interviews or surveys with those youth champions. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could give us a little bit more insight. And then my sort of follow-on question to that is actually for you, Preston, around, I know you spoke about this project being a sort of 5-year project, and I was just thinking a little bit about what the next steps are, just generally with regards to how you sort of thinking about monitoring or ongoing some of these efforts, or yeah, what the sort of thought is for the future.
So Claire, answering to your question, I'm not maybe the right person to answer this question, because all of this is actually looked by our meal manager. But to be very specific, we have specific indicators for each of the outcomes. So when we're talking about capacity building, it's about baseline surveys, post surveys. When we're talking about governance, it's about different indicators of good governance, accountability, transparency. So all these, I think there's 7 indicators for good governance. So we have different kind of indicators, and we've also spent good amount of time doing the baseline and endline for this project. So if you're interested, I can share the document with you.
Brilliant, thank you.
Oh, thank you for a good presentation about the case. I think you also mentioned about the risk of like the substance of the social norm and how the youth can participate in the community forest. So I also thinking about like the age gap or the generation gap, that when the youth can take part, but it's not really received or accepted positively. And I think it might be not challenge in your project, but it can be a general challenge for how we promote or want to involve youth in a lot of conservation projects.
I think I can answer that. So when we did the baseline for this project, one of the findings was that regardless of young people being willing to participate in conservation effort, the power gap will still exist because the adults, the old people, if I may say, these people are there in power. So no matter how much young people raise their voices, these adults will eventually make decisions. So there is a power gap that lies. And through our interventions, we've also tried to reduce the power gap. And the best way to reduce power gap is to have young people in power. And we are doing this by encouraging young people to become part of community forest committees so that these young people are the one managing community forest. And in one of our sites, we actually have a young person who has recently been nominated as the chair of the community forest. So I think having youth in the power is what we're striving to do, because the power gap exists, like you say, and we acknowledge that.
Thank you.
So just touching briefly, so yes, so TNRC as a project is coming to an end, but the capacities, so the folks like Shambhavi, like I said, that there are 10 or 12 different offices that did sort of concrete projects. Some of those are really big projects that'll actually outlive us. But all of that sort of capacity is going to continue. And we're exploring a couple of different ways of sort of institution. I think we're calling it sort of our institutionalization work stream. To in addition to that, make sure that all of these guides and resources and tools that we've produced continue to percolate and be accessed and used from the folks with whom we haven't yet worked. I see you unmuted us.
I was just going to ask if across all of these projects, if you've got sort of a standard set of indicators, and if you're sort of scaling up that measure to the sort of high level project, to understand the overall impact you've had across the board. And if you, I mean, you don't have to have done that, but I was just wondering, I'm really interested in that process of sort of scaling those indicators and scaling that measure of success.
Yes, so we have done that. It's primarily been in our reporting to USAID. And I'm actually trying to think, I don't think those are, at least not, they're not on our knowledge hub. They may be publicly available through USAID. But yes, we have a lot of indicators, including sort of like how many of these events have we done, right? But some more interesting ones that are kind of rolled up from some of the in-country activities. So everything from like numbers of beneficiaries or stakeholders reached. There are some indicators around like concrete policy changes achieved. So I'm going to make a note to follow up with you on that.
Cool. No, it's great. It's great to know that you guys have been doing that, because it's a really difficult thing to do when the projects are so different, and to sort of standardize that monitoring is really useful, but I just know how challenging it can be. So great to know that it's going on.
Yes, it didn't help that we lost our male person. She left a few months ago. But she left several years of a good structure that we've been able to follow for this final period. So just really quickly, I wanted to kind of bring us back to the results chains. This is one of the results chains. It's not quite final, but that we'll be using as part of. I mentioned that we'll have pilot stories for all the pilots, and so we have this one for Nepal for both phase 1 and phase 2. So I just wanted to show it there. It's exactly what Shambhavi was saying, that they started with this assessment focused on building capacity for both rights holders and duty bearers, and then especially in phase 2, mobilizing the power of youth champions to get more folks involved, to create an enabling environment, to increase the sort of accountability and the incentives for making those governance improvements. And then the final, so that was the WWF Nepal results chain. The final standard or high level results chain that we prepared is the one on social norms and behavior change. And we've highlighted here a couple of places where the work that Shambhavi and her colleagues in WWF Nepal did sort of informed what we did here. So again, there are specific things to bear in mind when you're doing your situation analysis for social norms and behavior change, both from a sort of communications perspective, the importance of like testing your messages, things like that, as well as some of those more corruption specific things, like trying to find out what is considered corruption and what isn't, what the motivators are, what function corruption is serving, like is it solving a problem? And so in the case of Nepal, sort of that governance gaps assessment that they did, looking at these different community forest user groups, took a lot of those things into account. Making sure that your target audience hears the message that you want them to hear, and then takes action on it. So this was something that Shambhavi mentioned explicitly about, like the importance of identifying, especially in phase 2, youth as those champions, but also making sure that they were also talking to other people, so that you end up with more than just the 25 or 40 folks that you directly engaged with. In the social norms and behavior change results chain that's in Marathi Share and that will be in Camel. Again, these red text boxes include links and resources to some anti-corruption specific tools and guidance. And then again, especially for social norms, sort of taking that systemic approach and making sure that in addition to understanding the motivations for certain behaviors and delivering a message of change, that you're also creating conditions to facilitate that change. And this is another thing that I appreciate that Shambhavi mentioned specifically about, like, there are social risks to becoming this good governance champion. I mean, that's relatively benign to some of the risks in certain contexts, but that you can think of sort of a frontline ranger who wants to do the right thing, but the powers that be don't. And so there are significant sort of like career and other risks that person would face to become sort of a champion of good governance. And if you don't fully understand those things and you go in just with one specific we're going to name and shame. We're here to uncover corruption. You're not actually solving the root cause. Yeah, so that was all that I wanted to cover. I was mentioning those indicators, especially for events like this. If you don't mind, before I'm happy to discuss and answer any other questions. But we do have a quick poll that would just be super useful for us in terms of our reporting. If we could throw that up, great.
I just launched it. Yep.
Thank you very much. And you don't have to show the results. We just need it for the reporting after. But yeah, so if you just, Theani, if you could just answer that, and then if there's anything else that you want to ask me or Shambhavi, or if anyone else wants to ask, happy to discuss with the few minutes that we have left.
Well,
Yeah,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to check whether, like, you said that this will be posted on Camel. So when will you expect to do that?
Imminently. So we submitted them. I'm sure I submitted some stuff wrong. So we might take a little bit of time to do that. But my understanding is that that the folks at Foundation of Success are working on it, and so it'll be available there soon. As soon as it's available there, or as soon as they are available there, we'll also go live with specific pages for each of them on our topic areas. So if you go to TNRCproject.org, you'll see all those different topic areas. And so the social norms behavior change one will be a resource under the social norms and behavior change topic area.